beyond our thinking. Oh, God of mysteries, gone, gone beyond our thinking. Happy is the one who comes to you. Happy is the one, happy are the two. And we dwell in your house, and we eat at your table, and we say the prayers as our hearts are able. Oh, God of mystery, beyond our thinking. Oh, God of mystery, gone, gone, gone beyond our thinking.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful summer, and on behalf of the Foundation for Non-Duality, we welcome you to our 9th roundtable discussion, where we, a panel of Jason Schulman's senior students and teachers, discuss the interface between ideas about non-duality and our daily lives. We're excited to be here with you. As you may or may not know, the Foundation for Non-Duality is dedicated to making the principles of non-dual thinking and practice, as articulated by Jason Schulman, available to the greater public for the purpose of transforming the consciousness of individuals in order to help alleviate suffering in the world. These principles and their practical application focus on the unitive connection between personal and transcendent consciousness, as the foundational basis for change and healing. Jason Schulman sees the study of non-duality, especially in its practical applications in everyday living, as part of the healing of the human soul. The aim is to live our lives both as healing and healthy individuals who are aware of and connected to the entire web of being, including the totality of who we are. Living the totality of our being means including all of our human parts in our awareness, from our great courage and longing to connect to our many imperfections that work against these aims. Jason Schulman's teachings are based on kindness toward the self and others, and the work of the foundation is to actualize this kindness in everyday life. If you don't know Jason Schulman, over the past 40 years of teaching, he's worked to reconcile the deistic or relative paths of liberation with the consciousness of Buddhism and other non-theistic paths to create a truly non-dual path of healing, one that does not exclude any aspect of reality. His work emphasizes the healing of the personal ego and its rightful place in any path that seeks liberation from ignorance and the awakening of compassion. It also seeks to bring the human world, with its imperfections, into alignment with the realization of transcendent awareness. In this way, we develop a conscious awakening to the sacredness of every sentient being and every time-bound moment. Okay, before we get into the conversation, why don't we take a few minutes and I'll lead you through a brief meditation. So just settle in. You can have your feet on the floor. Just make yourself comfortable. You don't have to be sitting erect. You can be leaning. That's okay. And just close your eyes for a moment, and I'll take you through this meditation. I call it inviting everything in. So begin just by being with your breathing. Be with your breath as it is. Don't get caught up in thinking your breath should be deeper or more regular or more even or better in some way. Your breathing, just as it is what's keeping you alive, and that is sufficient. So just be with your breathing for a moment. So, your intention in this meditation is to invite everything in. Begin with the sounds that are around you right now. Maybe you hear the sounds of other people talking in the background, maybe a car horn or a siren, maybe the wind or a bird. Invite all of those sounds in. We want them to be with you. We want them to be here. Now, invite all of the parts of yourself to be with you right now. The small, frightened parts, the courageous parts, the lazy parts, the devoted parts. Actually say to yourself in your mind, you, the one who forgets to be kind to yourself, be here with me. You, the selfish one, be here. Come in. You, the one who is argumentative, be here. You, the one who remembers God from time to time, be here too. You, the one who forgets God from time to time, be here as well. Invite all the parts of yourself and all the parts of your environment to be present right now in this moment. Whatever comes into your heart or mind, whether it is a difficulty or whether it is a great insight, it doesn't matter. They are all treated equally. Invite them in. Let's be with this all for a few minutes. Okay. So you can start to gently bring yourself back now, back to ordinary consciousness. And we're back. So today, it's an opportunity to have a conversation about our spiritual lives. that we want to do here today, what we want to do here today, is invite conversation. So there'll be time for audience interaction, and we really would love for you to participate in today's conversation. The conversation today is titled The Holy Ego. I'm joined by Damon Farnham and Henrik Nordmark. My name is Tim Rothschild, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. And why don't we jump right in? Let me open it up to the group. So I want to hear, what's your take on the ego, and how do we have a healing and awakening relationship to it? What does it look like when we relate to our egos in a non-dual way? Because how do we define the ego? All of these things we're going to need to talk about a little bit, and then we'll see where it goes. So,
yeah, I think it's interesting because I know that on some spiritual paths, especially some non-dual paths, or Vedic paths, as they're also known, there's sometimes this notion of trying to transcend the ego, or get rid of it, or try to see that this is some kind of complete illusion. And although I mean, I don't want to critique other paths, because I know they all have their place and value. I know specifically in the work of Jason Schulman and the one that we do here in the Foundation on Duality, we try to be much more inclusive about the ego, and we sort of see it as our friend rather than as an enemy. In fact, I know I've heard Jason say stuff like, the ego is like the vehicle through which we can experience wholeness. So it's really just a necessary aspect of life.
So why do you think? Sorry, Damon, I just want to ask this question. Why do you think the ego is looked at as something that's so troublesome? Because then the take that you're talking about is radical, right? We're including the ego, and what's its problem?
Right. What is its problem? or why do we have such a problem with it? I mean, I think what happens a lot of the time is that, we usually identify with the unhealed aspects of the ego. So when we feel our problems in life, when we feel, the things like being scared or separate, like our smallness, the parts of ourself that we feel like we don't like and we don't always know what to do with, we associate them with the ego. So, I think a common solution is to say, well, if I just get rid of the ego, I will get rid of all of those problems. So I think that is, that's one way that people experience it. And it's kind of this broad stroke way of making everything better. And one of the things that I love about Jason's work is that from the very beginning, we understand that when you really honor the nature of reality, everything has to be considered as holy. Even if we don't understand how to do that or how that might be true. And so, what we end up coming back to is this experience of, well, maybe instead of getting rid of the ego, there's a way to help it come more into its rightful place, as a healthy part, as kind of a, sort of what you were starting to say, Henrik, about, being more of actually part of the vehicle towards awakening instead of a hindrance of it.
Indeed. I think it's also interesting culturally how we talk so negatively about the ego. I mean, we talk about oh, that guy has a big ego, and we never talk about oh, that guy has a beautiful ego, a healthy ego, and yet we need the ego to experience life as an individuated person. I mean, the alternative would be we're just kind of this miasmatic wholeness, but there's no like personal point of view. And I think being embodied as human beings means like, yes, I have this experience of discrimination and things being separate things. There's the turtle over there. There's my cup of coffee over here, and then here's this physical boundary of my skin, and that kind of feels like me. But at the same time, also realizing that there's this interconnectedness to life and to all things, and that we're part of that fabric in a very, very intimate way. I guess it sometimes seems like an obstacle just because, if we're too much in a dualistic point of view of like, okay, there's me and there's you out there, then obviously that's a hindrance, it's an obstacle to seeing the wholeness and interconnectedness. But I think just focusing on one side or the other of that coin is misleading.
Yes.
I think to that point, I think that when we get so kind of worried about and focused on and identified with the sort of the problematic parts of our life, we tend to call that like, especially in spiritual paths, we tend to call that like that's the ego. But then there's this whole other aspect of the ego also, which like, recognizes like yesterday I was talking to somebody about just the aspect in psychology of differentiation, and that without differentiation you actually can't have relationship. So like as you try to have a healthier relationship with another person, you have to have very healthy sense of a separate self. So it's like I think what we kind of miss sometimes is the beautiful parts of the ego. And so we almost say, the ego is only the bad stuff, but like, what about the part of the ego that creates beauty or recognizes beauty, creates art, is inspired by something, even the part of us that has a longing to feel better, like that's the ego that like wants to feel better. Like that's a beautiful thing. Like it's actually pulling us towards, whatever you want to call that
Yeah.
we all work so hard towards.
Yeah.
It might be
Go on.
might be a good time. I pulled some quotes from Jason, and one of the things that he says about the ego is that it's the vehicle that enables us to live as individual personalities in finite bodies who are simultaneously manifestations of spirit beyond life and death. So he goes on to say the ego is a good tool for navigating the world of duality. It wants to keep us alive and has a particular way of going about it. And then the ego also exists in healed and unhealed states. So everything that you guys said so far, right? Just wanted to define that a little bit. And right, this is the ego. The way I see it is, when you do the non-dual thing, you include the fact that we're personal beings, right? But the unhealed ego sees it as separate only, right? There's no inclusivity of the impersonal sides of life, or just the fact that we're all in this together, right? We're all interconnected. Ego goes through the unhealed ego is in a contracted state and doesn't see those connections, and because of that, doesn't know how to operate in a healthy way, and tries to control the world and decides what's allowed and what's not allowed, judges things very quickly, and it's difficult to grow when you're like that, right? So how do you heal the ego, right? What's that look like?
Yeah. And what does that mean exactly?
Yeah.
I guess I like to think about it as the ego needs to find its place within the ecosystem. Like, you don't want a wolf to like eat all the creatures in the forest, but like it needs to have a proper relationship to everything that's there. And and the ego definitely has its place, right? It's not. Um, yeah, I mean, as Damon said, like it's what allows us to experience art, to have relationship with other people, to have kindness, to show compassion to somebody else. If there is not another person there to whom I can show compassion, then yeah, we're just one big blob of wholeness.
Right. Right. That like undifferentiated, that idealized state of undifferentiated oneness that we wish we could return to. That's seems to be always elusive. Yeah. I do think that, I mean, honestly, like the path of, or parts of the path of healing the ego are actually, some of them are very straightforward. Like this is, I think some of this is like the therapeutic work that I know all of us have, at times in our lives been involved in, kind of sorting through the parts of my personality that are, hard for me to live with, hard for somebody else to live with. It's kind of where a lot of my suffering, my personal suffering might come from, my neurotic tendencies. And one way I thought about this a couple of days ago was like, it's like that there can be parts of the ego that likes to be grandiose, likes to be bigger than it is, better than it is, more developed than it is, more spiritual than it is. And then, I know this for me too, and I know for a lot of people, is that there's also parts of the ego that feel like it has to be smaller than it is, diminished. There's something like, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. So these are all parts of that, that unhealed ego. So I think that the more that we can, quite honestly, like kind of try to start to wake up to these parts of ourself, the unhealed parts of ourself, become aware of them, work with somebody to have an actual relationship with these parts of ourself. This kind of like brings us back into that, I think what Jason a lot of times calls that right sized. So instead of being, bigger than we might be or smaller than we might be, we kind of return to, that kind of right sized place where then the ego, is healing, and it doesn't have to be as much problematic in our lives anymore. So I think that, that's these are some ways that I think about, like, how do we actually go about healing this?
Yeah. It sounds like to be the right size, you have to be in relationship to a lot of different things, right? So you talked a lot about psychological work that people need to do to wake up to their stories, right? If they're, I feel like I need to be more than what I am all the time, I'm going to try to be bigger. If I had a crazy childhood and I had to be small so nobody saw me and I didn't get hit or something like that, right? So we have to wake up to these aspects of the stories that we tell ourselves. And gosh, the nature of story is such that, parts of it are true, right? But part of what the unhealed ego does is it takes parts of the truth and it makes a whole out of it. It makes a whole
Right.
picture. And it says, because it's scared and it's living in fear, it says, now I've got it. All right, I understand that you remind me of the person that hit me when I was younger, so I'm going to avoid you. Right. So now we're also talking about psychological transference, how we all have a unique relationship to each piece of the world based on our histories. So, yeah, so a big part of healing the ego is awakening to our stories. And then, excuse me, Damon, you weren't here last roundtable, but we did talk about sort of presence and coming out of memory, what it's like to be awake to this stuff and then change who you are in relationship to what is now happening, right? So instead of being lost in it, it's like, wait, who am I now? And what is now occurring in my life? And if I believe myself to be different, connected in a whole way, how does that change my relationship to this now? Right? Maybe not everybody is against me, So
Right. Right. Just I'll throw this in. This was a little treat from you. I was in a class with Jason yesterday. I think Henrik, you were actually there too. But at some point, I wrote it down. What was it? Jason said something, and I was like, "Oh, that was beautiful." He said something like, you were talking about presence. We will only have presence to the extent that we have, that we're awake to the totality of our being. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's like the more we can wake up to ourself, that allows us to actually have presence in life. Like presence isn't just a muscular thing. Like I'm going to be more here, it's like, it's like it actually becomes a very natural state, because we've been able to be present to all of these different aspects ourselves, which are, all parts of the unhealed ego.
And often includes, or sorry, it often entails including more of ourselves, more and more of ourselves, which is part of the reason why we do those meditations at the beginning of these roundtables, of inviting everything in. We're inviting different aspects of ourselves in, and then we just get to experience more and more of ourselves without having to defend against, oh, I don't like that part of myself, but I do like this part of myself. And and that makes it sort of a safer, holier container.
Yeah. I'm curious, like I tried to wrestle with this a little bit when I thought about this talk, and I'm curious, you guys too, like we called this the holy ego. That's what we called this, right? So we, it's almost easier to talk about, the unhealed ego, because that's something that we all identify with in our personal lives. So when Jason, so this is just, I'm just kind of like opening up this part of the conversation because I'm curious. When Jason talks about the holy ego, what in the world are we talking about? Like, how does that like how can the ego itself be considered holy, I guess?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's separate from the rest of the fabric of reality, right? So it's made of the same stuff. And also, another quote that Jason sometimes uses is, God didn't make a mistake creating egos. Like, surely there was a purpose for that. And I really do think that the purpose is so that we can experience the delights of being these individuated beings that we would otherwise not get to experience. It's kind of almost like a game of hide and seek of wholeness with itself.
I also, yeah. And I also see the holy ego as, a recognition that the healing ego, it's a facet of the whole, right? So as it's healing in us, the world looks different because we're no longer seeing through the eyes of opposition, right? So we're no longer in conflict with everything. So the holy ego is like, it's like an awareness thing. It's a recognition that the ego is super important and it needs to be included, and it's the perfect vehicle for awakening. It just needs to not be the captain of the ship. It needs to be the deckhand, right? And then we have the possibility for true freedom, because we can come out of memory when we're doing that. That's what I think.
And yet it can still serve its useful purpose of saying, it's like, okay, I'm going to eat this piece of salmon because that's good for me, and I'm not going to drink this turpentine because that is bad for me. And
You reminded me something that I meant to say as well, is that the ego is interesting, right? Because it does a good job of keeping us alive for the most part, right? And I had an interesting experience with it because I'd done a lot of healing work on myself for a few years, and then I got very ill for like 6 years. And I watched how sort of some of the work I had done kind of went away in my ego. There's a sort of like a regression, and it's sort of like I needed to protect myself, and I forgot about certain teachings, and I forgot about how to be, see the world in a whole way. It was a very interesting process, and in a way, it's like I could see how important it is to be able to have defenses like that, and to be able to pull away and to be separate, and to heal in that way as well. So it's been an interesting process coming back, healing the ego again and getting healthy again, and sort of realizing the ways that my ego gets in the way and creates problems in this. So
It's very, I mean, I'll throw out a little here's a little vulnerable prompt for you guys, because you just made me think of, Tim. I don't know. How does your ego get in the way?
Oh, Henrik, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. There are lots of silly ways in which I feel that I sometimes let the ego interfere with what would otherwise be good for me. Like, I don't know. I'll see, I don't know, a concert or a book or a workshop or something that, my ego has opinions about, judgments about, and I later discovered, like, oh, had I gone with my first, I don't know, instinct of like, oh, that could be interesting, even though it's not the usual thing that I would be into. Um, it, yeah, it could have been an enriching, enlivening experience, um, and yet, because I'm trying to maintain a certain facade of, Henrik likes these kinds of things and not those things. And that's a rather trivial example, but I'm sure it also plays out at larger scales and more problematic scales.
Right. Like, I'm sure, I mean, I don't know, I know for me, but like that could even play out on the level of like relationship with human beings. Like there's certain people that I, feel adverse to, or whatever. And anyway, I'm just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Let me add, because the question made me think of how the sort of the arc of my healing journey. When I was really young, I really clinged to the idea of being a football player. I thought if I could be a professional football player, then I'm strong and I got it figured out. And so I went into it. It was like I didn't even realize it was a trance until like I got injured and my career was over in college, and I was like, who am I now? It was like a total identity crisis, right? And that really started the idea of, it's like, oh, okay, so if I can't be this, who am I? And long story short, what came up for me was really, it was about perfectionism. I wanted to be a perfect something. And for me, the way it still gets in that way is whenever I'm not perfect, or I perceive myself not as perfect, I have an enormous shame that comes up. And it brings up all kinds of stories. And I start spinning and spinning. And so it's hard. I have to use a lot of Jason's practices to come out of memory, right? To awake, first to be awake to the stories, have enough space around them so that I can be in the moment and actually say, okay, I'm in something now where, or maybe I wasn't perfect, right? I did a radio show, or I did the Nondual Roundtable and I screwed up on something. My unhealed ego says, you're an idiot. You'll never be good again. It says all kinds of terrible things. So perfectionism has been a big one for me, and wanting to be special was a big one too. Right. So I need to be awake to that. Right. As we share this work more, and maybe some of us teach it, right? We need to be careful not to want everyone to love us, right? We just want to be ourselves, because it's a lot of work.
On that note, I'd like to bring up the topic of the spiritualized ego. So the ego that wants to portray itself, be seen as, oh, I'm such a spiritual person, and please love me because, I'm so enlightened, I'm so awakened, I'm such a wonderful healer. And because at one level, that urge to be a spiritual ego, or an ego that seeks spirituality, can carry us forth on our spiritual path. So it's serving a useful purpose, and yet at the same time, at some point, we need to either abandon that or at least let go of that association as tightly as might one begin with it, and just be okay. Well, I am who I am, and I choose this journey, but it's no longer this kind of neurotic attachment to being as spiritual as one could possibly imagine to be.
Yeah, it's like another version of what Tim was just saying. It's like, it's like, okay, so I'm no longer identified with being like, for me, like I was a rock climber, for forever in my life. So it's like, and it became a huge part of my persona, and I kind of knew it at the time, but I was enjoying it. So I wasn't that concerned with it. But it's like, and then it would be easy to sort of like, okay, if I'm going to move out of that world and focus more on my spiritual life, it's like almost just kind of take that same thing and overlay it on the spiritual world now. It's like, now this is who I am, and it's like, so I mean, if you really think about that, if you just change that overlay from one arena to another, the self didn't really change. Like it didn't, like that wouldn't have required me to actually, like drop further into the whoever I truly am. It would just be like a shifting of persona, So, and these are hard things to wake up to. I really want to be honest about that. Like, when they're big in our lives and they're in the way and they're a problem, and they're causing obvious suffering or problems in our relationship or, a career, it's kind of easy to like see them and track towards them and work on healing them, and I think the further you go down on this path, sometimes these things become very subtle. It's like a fish trying to wake up in the fact that it's in water. It's like you need, I don't know, maybe we don't need to talk about that, like how that happens, but it's tricky. It's hard to like almost see, those subtler atmospheres that, we end up sort of living within that we don't even know. Might be a little off topic, but just a thought. Yeah.
Well, I think you're naming just part of the awakening journey for the ego, right? There's a lot of facets to it, a lot of different layers of how reality organizes itself that we sort of need to be awake to. And it seems to me that the job of the ego is literally to relate to everything. It's like, what the heck, right? But it seems that that's the case, right? The healing ego needs to somehow be in relationship to everything in the world. What do you think? Is that true or not?
Yeah, to the extent that it's able to,
Yeah,
to do so, and obviously, I don't think anybody can do that perfectly, but we can get more and more practiced at it. And maybe on that note, I'm curious to hear from you guys. What are some examples, positive examples of having experienced the healing ego, an ego that maybe felt a little bit more in alignment or in proper relationship with wholeness?
I could start with that one. On the one hand, well, I guess maybe the first thing I'll say is like on kind of like the very personal relative level, like, I think when the ego is healing and we start to feel safer in ourselves as we are, when we do screw up, when we do hurt somebody that we love, as an example, or when we do, something kind of unconscious, it feels less scary to own it. And, maybe apologize and be like, oh my God, like, I really did. I get that I really hurt you, by what I just said or how this unconscious behavior of mine. And you are able to, like, it's safe to like feel the remorse about that and actually say to somebody, I'm sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. I didn't know I did that. And it's like, to me, that feels like a healthier ego has the ability to kind of do that. Instead of saying, no, like, I didn't, kind of like having a defensive posture only, or a, explaining away or a deflective, so it's like much more relational like that.
Yeah, it's not so life and death whether you're wrong about this and you've committed some sin.
Right. And then I think, one of the other ways that I really like that Jason talks about this is that, the unhealed ego is very, it's the part of us that's we're bumping into it all the time. So it's very easy to see. And I think a lot of times when the ego does become more healthy and integrated, it actually becomes quite invisible. So it's like, it's not that it's gone, it's just that it's like integrated into our body, mind, spirit. And so I think that, that's, and not doing that sort of prematurely or almost as another sort of perfectionistic attitude, but more as a, kind of like it's like a natural kind of coming into, Anyway.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost like the healing ego is like a comfortable shoe, right?
Right.
Now, if it's in alignment with wholeness, you won't even notice it's there. The moment the ego starts like trying to fight reality, you start feeling pain in your feet. It's uncomfortable. And, yeah.
I'll add as part of my healing journey, again, just to piggyback on the perfectionism piece, that's really what I'm thinking about right now in terms of healing the ego for me. Man, being able to show up as you are, right? A lot of this work is like the ultimate come as you are party. Like, to come as you are, oh my gosh, it's so hard to do. But, part of the healing of the ego is to keep doing that. And it's, for me, to be able to do that in a safe space was hugely important, right? Because like, I couldn't do that around my friends growing up, right? Because we've got a totally different relationship, right? They're not even on a healing journey, right? So they're not gonna care. They're not gonna, I can't always be myself. But in a group setting where everybody's doing that together, man, that was so important to me to be able to do that, and to feel the terror that would come up, and then to have it be met with compassion. That was life changing for me. Something I'm still working on.
Maybe I could relate this. I see a question from somebody in the chat.
All right.
Which is, I think we can tie it right into what you just asked, Henrik, too. So, Michael asks that, he understands that the unhealed ego is holy because it is part of the totality. Like, he gets that. But in everyday experience of life, when we're frustrated, angry, etc., how do we relate these parts as holy as well? It's a great question.
So, I don't know, that might be too challenging in the moment at times. But what I would say is, at the very least, you can maybe show some kindness towards the frustrated one, the angry one, the sad one, the one who's having, judgmental thoughts, or and maybe there'll be times when you'll have a broader perspective and it's easier to see the holiness of all of that. But sometimes we're in the midst of anger, and then honestly, it's like just trying to include an iota of extra kindness there, and that's already a huge step forward.
And for me too, I was just thinking about this is when we're lost in these feelings, that's one thing, right? Like when they sort of overtake us, that's a whole different ball game. But I guess even then, like within a lot of the work that we do in this space, we work with these states and we find ways to work with them and give them a place. We find ways to, let them exist and relate to them, but not necessarily be lost in them or taken over by them or completely identified with them. And it does seem like that, when you can have something like that and you can start to, work with it, give it a place, even in the meditation that you started us with, Tim, it's like, we're inviting in these difficult parts of it as part of that meditation. And for me, sometimes in that practice, I end up feeling this sort of sense of more spaciousness. It's interesting. I've invited more in, yet I feel more spacious. And, so for me, it's like as the work progresses and we're able to work with these hard parts of us, in these ways, it does create for me personally a sense of more space inside of myself. And as I go, then like the next time that I feel really frustrated, I'm a little bit less lost in it. And, now I'm a little bit more, if I'm lucky, if I'm having a good day, a little bit more spacious. And that is sort of a component of life that's inside of me, as part of my whole. And it starts to feel that way. It starts to feel like it's part of my whole. And it's not just the part of me that takes me away from it. So that's a little bit about, I guess, maybe my own experiences with this.
It's very well said. I'll just add a different dimension in terms of sort of the way I work with it. Typically, things like anger, especially. First step, like you guys said, I have to be awake to it. Right. So I have to know, I'm angry right now, and I give it a place. Right. I'm not judging it and saying this isn't allowed to go. I'm angry. So obviously there's intelligence here. This difficulty is precious. And it's precious because it's my unique difficulty. So part of what I do is I give it a place. And then I start to ask myself, how do I want to relate to the anger today? What do I need? What's going on here? Right. And that's the spaciousness that you guys are talking about, right? The space to start to ask questions and inquire into what's going on. Right. So the non-reactive unhealed ego, the healing on non-reactive ego has the opportunity to inquire within it and start to have a more intimate relationship with what's going on. And that helps with the unfolding, right? And it also helps with alchemy. All spiritual work is alchemy, right? So as we're tolerating the anger and not falling into a trance with it, as we're tolerating it, it's being metabolized. Something is going on, and at that time, perhaps your consciousness can start to shift as well because you're changing along with it by doing it this way. So, how do I want to relate to it now? It's a great question to ask.
And actually, related to that, I think sometimes I've heard some people speak about, I had this angry thought, and now I need to like immediately reframe that and try to force myself to fix this. And I actually think that that's really, really counterproductive oftentimes. I mean, sometimes, we might be in a place where it's like, okay, we can reframe things and see things in a different light, and great if that happens. But at other times, the angry thought is just there, and it needs some place to exist and live. And in fact, trying to force it to change prematurely is actually just keeping it in place. And there's that phrase of, what you resist persists. And so again, going back to that idea of kindness, like, giving it its place, as you said to Tim, say, okay, there's a place for this anger. I might not want to be completely identified and absorbed by it, but I am going to give room for it to just be.
So another comment. The non-dual view understands that separateness and oneness depend upon each other. They arise together as a pair and do not exist as separate things with their own existence. The ego pulls us toward wholeness because it is part of this totality. What do you think about that?
It's actually great. I was thinking there was one little kind of idea I wanted to try to bring in before we wrapped up, and I think this ties right into it, which is the fact it's kind of where you started, Henrik, which is this idea of oneness. And on the spiritual path, that especially when you're dealing with the ego, we demonize the ego and we say we should just, the goal should be this sort of dissolution into the oneness of reality. And that's, well, it's certainly out there in the spiritual world a lot. But I did want to kind of acknowledge that a lot of people on a spiritual path have had awakening experiences, sometimes earlier in their life, under different circumstances, but they'll have sometimes a moment, sometimes more moments, sometimes, big experiences where they'll have a glimpse of what they feel like is kind of that, the true nature of reality. And it will almost be a catalyst that will take them through on their spiritual path, and that it can be it's very valuable, right? Because it gives you a sense of I don't know, I mean, of something that you're being pulled towards, which is exactly what this comment is saying. I think that the trap is when we end up thinking that that we should be able to live in that as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of saying, this experience is informing me and helping my ego to, be pulled towards something that may help it soften and heal, I think, I should be able to have that all the time. And then pursuing that can actually be a very destructive, from my experience, from what I've seen in other people too, experience on the spiritual path if you're not careful. It starts to eliminate our humanness. I don't know what you guys think about that, but I wanted to bring that in.
It reminds me of a story that Jason shared when I was going through the 4-year Engage training program. I remember him describing how he had a few Satori experiences of having these great feelings of connectedness, and then for a while, there was the desire to sort of like chase after more of those experiences. And you can sort of see why, right? It seems like a very pleasant state to be in, and all of that. But he also emphasized this point. It's like, well, once the telephone has rang, you don't need to have it keep ringing. You can just pick up the phone. And so once the ego realizes that there's more to life than just the immediate confines of duality, I think that can already be enough of a powerful catalyst to kind of carry us on that journey. And if a nice Satori experience happens here and then, it's like, great, enjoy it while it lasts.
Absolutely.
One last thing that just popped in my mind, because I was thinking about this in my own personal life. The more I was able to heal the parts of myself that were always defending against life, the more I had a chance at creativity, like true creativity, because I had all of this part of myself that was always on guard, always hyper vigilant and trying to figure out, am I being the right person now? Am I the right size? Big, small, whatever. Am I what I need to be? And rather than having that happening all the time, I can now be more creative. I can be myself. So I think, anyway, something we didn't mention was creativity is a sign of the healing ego as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, guys, listen, this was great. We gotta wrap it up. Just remember, this is brought to you by the Foundation for Non-Duality, and we survive and thrive on your donations. So we're going to keep doing this the second Friday of every month. We're going to get together and we'll do this. And just thanks so much. Damon, Henrik, you guys were awesome. Gina and Mike in the background. And of course, thank you, Jason, for this beautiful work. We'll see you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good to be with you guys.
You bless the years as they roll on by, and the days are a sign of what you're thinking. We want eternity.